Thank you all for joining us for cybersecurity in an increasingly risky world. I'm Sarah Fellner, Vice President of Global Marketing here at PKWARE. Before we get started, as you saw in the chat, there's functionality that will cast your questions over to us, so feel free to add any of those throughout the webinar as you have them. With that, I'm really excited to introduce our two experts for today's webinar. We have Heidi Shey, Principal Analyst of Security and Risk at Forrester, and Jason Dobbs, Chief Technology Officer at PKWARE. So hey guys, how's it going?
Hey, going well. Thanks everyone for joining today.
Going great. Thanks for having us.
Great. Heidi, I want to start with you. So there's a new-ish term, security is a business problem. So when it comes to data breaches and cybersecurity, most of us think of this as an IT issue. So is this a change to the overall cybersecurity landscape, or is this more of a shift in thinking that probably should have occurred a little bit sooner?
I don't know if it's like a recent shift or not. I don't think it's like a recent elevation of it either. I feel like we've been moving in this direction for a while now. If I think back to even like pre-pandemic, like 2018, 2019 range, where we saw the rise in ransomware really shooting up. And at that point in time, it was pretty apparent to companies that, yeah, there was a pretty close tie-in between cybersecurity risk as well as business risk in the case of operational risk and issues of business resiliency. And then fast forward to today, I mean, that's still the case. Cyber risk is business risk. And there are some recent events, I think, that also highlight that too. Like if we think about like the SolarWinds attack from, that was like 2 years now, that the impact of that was that after the fact, they had their credit ratings downgraded after the breach that they had. And this is a thing that it doesn't happen immediately after a breach event. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years. In the SolarWinds case, they were attacked in 2020, but S&P didn't downgrade them until 2021. And then even more recently, there was this case with a proposed order from the FTC against a company called Drizzly. These are the folks who do your online alcohol delivery. And this was interesting because there was actually implications of individual liability against the CEO of Drizzly for the company's security failures that led to their breach. So this was like, wow, it's a wow moment. It's not final yet, but if it does come through unchanged, then this order and the requirements, these are things that follow that CEO to future companies that they work at. So that certainly raises the stakes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so Jason, can you speak to that from a PKWARE standpoint? I know we hear a lot about this from like our customers, but what does this mean from a business perspective?
I agree with Heidi. We've been moving in this direction for a fairly long while, both just looking at what we're doing at PKWARE and also what we're seeing at our customers. I think from a business perspective, the easiest way to tie it back is there's real tangible money on the line, right? So when we look at ransomware attacks, or if we look at different fines that might be levied against companies for non-compliance, costs of being out of compliance drive decision making, right? And I'm not just talking about GDPR or CCPA or PCI, right? But like there's some industry specific regulations like TSACs that are shaping the overall business behavior, not just IT's behavior as it's related to cybersecurity. You combine that with the fact that nobody wants to be on the front page of the New York Times, that reputation damage has additional potential financial ramifications that are typically hard to measure, right? So it's pretty obvious to me why cybersecurity is becoming a business issue. I think in the end, the business looks at these issues like they would any other risk to the business. And how much do we want to spend to mitigate it? I think that's where, when we look at IT departments, I think that's where IT departments are struggling a little bit because, I mean, let's say I spend $1 million on a cybersecurity program and there's no breach, right? I mean, then I have to go back to the business and justify, why did you spend $1 million, right? And the flip side of that, if I am breached, either I'll get criticized for, not spending enough on the programming, or the business will think my security program isn't effective. So I think that's shaping a couple of additional trends. And I'd be interested in what Heidi thinks about this as well. I think we're seeing that the emphasis is switching to employee training to get the entire business involved. And on top of that, the IT department not just focusing on preventing attack, but like what can we do to enable the business to get back up and running in the face of an attack?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, like, absolutely agree that emphasis on getting everybody involved. But there's a bit of a nuance there as well, because you think employee training, there's like a right way to do it, and then there's a wrong way to do it too, where you don't want to penalize people for getting things wrong. Like, we've seen that happen in companies, and that makes things go sideways. It's more about how do you build a better culture of security within an organization, just across for all your employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're on this topic right now, and Jason, you kind of just talked about this, right? So when we think of data leaks and breaches, the focus is almost always on the amount of data lost, number of records impacted, or the total monetary cost. So what I'm interested in are some of those non-monetary effects that you kind of mentioned earlier. And I know you've mentioned like cyber insurance in the past. Anything you want to touch on there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Cyber insurance, I think that's not necessarily a non-financial motivator. I mean, there's financial motivation because as those rates are increasing, the insurance companies themselves are asking for more and more programs to be in place. So the more boxes that you can check, the lower you can keep your rates. But I think we're not just talking about prevention there. We are talking about that ability to respond and business resiliency. And I think the cyber insurance companies are also looking at that, right? Because if you insure a company and the business is defunct, that's not, it's not exactly a great position to be in. I think, at PKWARE, we believe that the value in the business is in its data, right? So I think organizations really do need to start taking a data-centric approach to the way that they're going to conduct their overall security efforts. And if you look at all of the attacks that are getting headlines, they are very data-centric. Ransomware, they're holding your data, or they're pulling your data exfiltration, and they're taking advantage of that. And you have to keep in mind that the people that are conducting these attacks, they're not just some guy in a basement, right? These are well-run organizations with like their own help desks and stuff like that. So they know the value of the data, and they're going to start targeting the data that has higher value. On the black market, Social Security numbers probably worth a couple bucks right now, but like a patient's health record, it's worth over $100, right? The attackers know this, so that's why that's what's shaping the trends. They're following the value of the data, and they're chasing that value.
Absolutely, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Heidi, I know in addition to cyber insurance, you had mentioned earlier in the week the potential impact of a breach on the security staff as a whole. So burnout, mental health, turnover, cost of recruiting, you name it. Do you want to expand a bit on that?
Sure. Because originally when I saw this question get posed, it was like, oh, it all kind of comes back to some type of monetary effect or impact. Like the more you unpack it, the more you can kind of see that direct line. Even if we're talking about things like the impact to your security staff, burnout is huge, to things like impact on people's mental health, to things like your team quitting because they're just so fed up with all that's being asked of them, and the stressful nature of the job as well. So if that happens, staff turnover, that has its associated cost. There's a cost to recruit, to hire. This is something that takes time. It's also a really competitive environment for trying to do this right now. And this impact to people, I mean, the staffing challenges is one where I'm most concerned about today, just because people are at a breaking point, it seems, in a lot of organizations over the events of the last couple of years, and it's not about to let up. And these are the folks are the ones behind your security program. So without them, things crumble.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So you kind of talked about the workforce, right? So let's stick with you on this question here. So businesses are experiencing a shift, right, to remote work, hybrid offices, different opportunities within the office, even movement to the cloud. So what kind of challenges, security challenges, I should say, does this bring to the table? Or do we need more of a security mind set shift?
Quite a few. If I think about it from like a data security, privacy type of perspective, there are certainly challenges for employee privacy. If we think about the organizations that are trying to do things around employee monitoring, for example, some of this may be for monitoring for productivity. Some might be trying to monitor because of compliance purposes. Others are trying to do this to tackle issues of insider risk. But all of this, no matter what reason you have, it's still monitoring. So that runs into some issues, whether you're in Europe or other countries where employee privacy is a concern. And I'm also talking about places like the US, Canada. We've got some recent legislation that's passed that's specific to employee monitoring. So with all this and the changing landscape of regulations, companies have to be really careful in how they approach this. There's also challenges if we think about information governance. That's another big one. So you have people working remotely, trying to collaborate virtually. Think of all the virtual meetings that are happening, even this one that we're on together now over Zoom. These things get recorded. What happens to those files? Who has access to this recording of the meeting afterwards? How is this recording protected? How long does it actually exist? What type of sensitive information might be within this recording? These are all questions that people need to consider. And then there's also issues of things like employee communications. If we think about the chat apps that employees might be using, maybe they're corporate issued, maybe they're consumer ones. What are they communicating through these apps? And that's a key thing too, going back to this point about data security. We have to, one of the shifts here is reconsidering what is sensitive data. It's not just, your documents, like your Word documents, your PowerPoints and Excels. Think about other formats that it could be in, whether that's email, whether that's like an employee chat, for example. So that forces us to also think about, well, what will those control points be based on how your employees are getting their work done today and the environments that your company has data in today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is something we often talk about at PKWARE, right? This is kind of our bread and butter. And Jason, what are your thoughts here on that one?
Yeah, I love where Heidi went with this, right? Because when I think of remote or hybrid working, right, it's been shifting in that direction for a long time, particularly like in engineering. But the pandemic made it everybody's problem, and it kind of hit organizations, I think, out of the blue, because I think historically when companies start talking about sensitive data, they really thought about databases, things that were kind of inside the four walls. So in addition to just the work from home, it's the move to cloud, right? So now I've got data in those apps that Heidi was talking about, right? I've got data in Teams or Slack. I've got data in Zoom. I've got data in Salesforce or whatever other SaaS packaged apps. And I think not only are we taking a look at where that data exists, but it's like, now how are users sharing that data? I mean, I think the way I look at users is they're kind of the chaos monkey in the business, right? Because they're the least predictable consumers and publishers of sensitive data. So, a user could take a data out of Salesforce, for instance, and then paste that into a PowerPoint presentation. They'll send that presentation through Slack, Teams, whatever. Then multiple copies exist on different user folders. Maybe it goes into a document management system, but kind of tracking all those locations the data ends up is a challenge. So if you can have the protection actually follow that data around, that's something that can be advantageous to an overall security program. And the reality around files is the value of a file. I mean, the value decays almost immediately. I mean, I think, and I don't remember where I read the statistic, but most files aren't accessed more than 30 days after they're created. So you've got the sensitive information. It sits on a user's hard drive. They've got their computer for 5 years, and then they leave that computer in a bus, something like that, right? So now what's the overall risk to the business there? So I think you start talking about data security policies, but you also start talking about retention policies kind of in the same breath to address those types of issues that users are introducing because they're working from home.
Yeah, absolutely. And so while we're on that topic, and Heidi, we'll start with you on this one, there's really not a one size fits all security solution for every business out there. So instead, security should really be based on an organization's capabilities and infrastructure. Did you have some thoughts on that?
I do. I also wanted to touch on something that Jason had just mentioned not
Perfect.
too long ago
Great.
about the whole retention
Yeah.
piece of it, because oh my gosh, that is a thorny issue, because it's not just a technology issue either. So much of it is around process, but also policy, because we've seen organizations where they really struggle, even if they have a committee dedicated to this, where they can't decide how long should we retain things for, because compliance requirements, maybe they tell you, but a lot of times they don't. And it's up to the business to decide, well, what is that reasonable length of time? And that's a challenging thing when you've got parts of the business who want to hold on to this forever, and other parts who say, well, it's a liability, we don't need this, we need to get rid of it. But coming to that point of agreeing of when do we delete things, how long do we retain, that's a hard thing to get to. So I guess the point is, it's not just about technologies, there's a lot of other things that go around it. But then going back to this question, talking about the actual technologies, I mean, basics are not necessarily easy, I guess, is one way to frame this. It's more, what are the absolute core things that you should be trying to do and implement and work on? And to me, I think it's going to be capabilities around understanding your data, because that's the thing that you're trying to protect. So what can you do in terms of technology capabilities for discovery, for classification, help you identify, well, what's sensitive data, as well as what is data that you might have obligations to protect, whether that's because of compliance reasons or contractual reasons. It could also be helpful when it comes to identifying, okay, what next? Now, what are the specific security controls that you should implement to protect this data now that you know what it is that you have? And part of that could be looking at capabilities that could enable least privilege, for example, like access controls. That could be things like multi-factor authentication to come into play. It's also thinking about how are employees accessing this data. A lot of times it's going to be through an endpoint device, like their laptop or desktop computer. So what capabilities do you have to protect those endpoints from security threats? So that, I think, is another key technology capability to build. And beyond that, another one might be to look at the kind of capabilities you could start to build around cloud governance, because oftentimes these are the new environments that your data is sitting in today. So doing things like identifying what might be sanctioned as well as unsanctioned cloud apps and workloads that are currently in use, to get a sense of just where all that data is going.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jason, what are your thoughts here on the universal basics? What should our attendees on this call really lean into?
Yeah, I mean, Heidi just hit on all the different areas where that data can end up, right? And I think that's what introduces the challenge to most organizations. So, starting with where do I build my security stack? I mean, it's definitely going to be unique to the business, and it's going to be different based on the size of the business. And obviously, I'm a little bit biased because of how PKWARE enables our customers to understand and protect their data. But I really believe that the challenge that every organization is going to face is how do I create that holistic view of my data, right? And then once I have that holistic view, or as I'm building that holistic view, I have to make some decisions on how to protect that data. Heidi made the point of the retention policy, right? And that's the users are going to feel differently about the retention policy than, say, IT, right? And having those conversations and engaging with the business to make some of those decisions is absolutely important. So I think when we look at universal basics, I think it's really comes down to communication. You have to be communicating with your business units, you have to be communicating with your users. If there's one thing that I've noticed, if you interrupt a user's workflow, or if you get in their way, or if you throw up a dialogue that says, no, you can't do that, users are pretty they have a lot of ingenuity, and they'll figure out a way around that, and maybe they take a screenshot and then they text that to somebody because they couldn't email it, right? So having controls that kind of take all of that into consideration and then can find that sensitive data, that's important. And then, like I said earlier, policy and protection really do need to follow the data regardless of where it goes. So that's something that I know we help our customers build out that policy, but that's definitely something to consider when you're building out that solution stack.
Yeah. And so some organizations push back on data breach prevention because of the perception around it, right? So especially for smaller businesses, is that the cost of prevention outweighs the potential cost of a breach? So what can executives do to understand how worthwhile their investment is? And from the ROI perspective, is there a dollar amount on it, or how should they really prove that return? And Heidi, I know in your role, you see this from many angles. So we're really interested to hear some of your key points here.
I guess I look at this and I think cybersecurity investment it's essential because it's non-negotiable today. It's just like how you would invest in your employees, how you would invest in your other infrastructure that enable business operations. This is a part of it as well. If we think about different kinds of organizations, I think the impact you can start to break down in different ways of why it could be essential. From let's say a B2B business, for example, don't invest in cybersecurity and you may not get the deal because you are now viewed as a third-party risk by your customers, also your partners, because maybe they don't want to work with you because they don't trust that you have your house in order when it comes to cybersecurity, whether that's protecting your own data or information and data that may be shared between the two organizations if you are to enter some type of a partnership and work together. And so ultimately, not investing in cybersecurity it makes life more difficult, more challenging for your sales teams, as well as others. From let's say you're a B2C type of organization, this is something where not investing in cybersecurity could have negative impacts on the overall customer experience of what it is that you're trying to deliver in terms of products and services, the perception of your company and its reputation if you are to go through some type of breach or security incident, or maybe a disruption due to an attack, something that also disrupts the customer experience because maybe now you can't fulfill orders or people can't access what they're typically getting from you in terms of what services you provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an interesting point that you brought up was around the partner ecosystem, right? We have a lot of partners ourselves. And Jason, do you want to maybe speak to that side of it a bit more and weigh in here on this?
Yeah, when I first saw this question, I thought, where do we see the most discrepancy? And I think we see the most discrepancy based on company size, right? The smaller companies have less resources, less ability to hire top cybersecurity talent, right? And I have firsthand knowledge of a local Milwaukee B2B company that struggled to survive after a ransomware attack. Customers lost faith in them. Their own sales team lost faith in them. They had mass exodus. It's when you have something, especially in their case, it was a business resiliency issue. It can cripple the organization. And if it is table stakes to have a good security posture now, and because the failure to do so it represents way too much risk to the business. So I think when I look at those smaller organizations that have less resources, my recommendation would be that they look at a managed security service provider or an MSP to help control that security posture. It's the easiest way to scale with the business because typically those organizations are pricing on a per user basis. So as the business finds success, they can continue to expand, that the cybersecurity services throughout the organization. I think I saw, Wayne from Excel IT is one of the attendees here. He's one of those partners that we use up in Toronto, right? And as businesses find success, they can handle that incremental cost. And then going back to the cybersecurity point earlier, it helps them check more boxes because the the MSSP is going to just have it be a part of their standard solution stack. And a lot of those MSPs will also specialize in verticals. So not only are you getting, that general protection, but you're getting those protections that are specific to your industry, right? So I think when you look at small, medium, that's a really great place to start. Takes away a lot of the guesswork. And, when it comes to a large enterprise, they've got more resources and they're charting their own path, and most of them have pretty good cybersecurity programs, so it's less of a concern there. I feel like Heidi had a thought on that.
Yeah. That was a great point about going to MSPs for help with these types of things, especially for a smaller or mid-sized organization. There's also a nice little bonus there if we're talking about cyber insurance as well, because that is something that these organizations can do to help uplift their security posture. And in some cases, these managed security services providers also have a cyber insurance partner where, let's say you're using their services, there's a good chance that you may be able to qualify for some type of discount on your premium on a policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was it for our main questions. We're gonna look in the chat and see if there are any questions from our attendees, but is there any kind of closing thoughts before we roll into the Q&A portion of this? All right. So we do have one question. So is what you've been discussing more prevalent in the US, or are there any other countries that have unique needs that you'd like to share? Heidi, do you want to start with this one?
I'm just trying to think about what we've covered so far. And I think, at least from my perspective, the kinds of things that I was sharing was probably more centric to the US and maybe parts of Western Europe.
Okay.
And pretty general, not country specific, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, in general, right, a good security posture is pretty universal, regardless of where the business is located. But each region is going to have its own specific regulations and compliance requirements. Obviously, in Europe, you're going to have GDPR, and here in US, you're going to have CCPA. Brazil's got their own privacy laws, and they're not exactly one-to-one. So there's a lot going on there. And then the other thing that I thought of when you asked that question was TISAX, which is a automotive industry regulation in Germany, not it's actually imposed by the automobile manufacturers on their supply chain, right? And that supply chain isn't just necessarily in Germany, it's wherever their supply chain is, right? So that kind of, I think it's more industry specific in a lot of cases than it is geographic outside of those privacy regulations.
Perfect. All right, let me see if there's another one. So Jason, it looks like this might be a question for you. So what shifts in IT teams are you seeing as a result of data security becoming a business issue or business need?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest shifts is the need to, and then we already touched on this a little bit, is the need to engage individual business units. I think the idea that an IT department or even a cyber department understands a business unit's data well enough to decide what kind of protections need to be put around that data, that's asking way too much of IT or cyber in that case, right? So their need to continually engage the business as a part of the solution, rather than just viewing them as a problem, I think is the biggest shift that I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Heidi, did you have any thoughts on that one?
I would agree. It's like that engagement across the organization. And there was another dynamic that I've started to see happening within organizations where folks who are, I guess, more in, maybe it's like a data team type of role, but people sitting on the business side, different lines of business, who are recognizing that data security is important, that the data has value when it actually gets used, and they're trying to use more data as an organization, but they're tired of hearing either no or like, hang on, let's try to figure this out, coming from the IT and the security side. And so now you have these line of business leaders going out on their own, trying to figure out, well, what's a possible approach? They're looking at possible solutions that could help them and bringing them in to have the IT team, to have security check it out to say, hey, can we use this? Could this be something that helps to enable this particular use case, or how we want to be working and how we want to be using data today? So it's a neat kind of dynamic that's happening, and a new kind of partner, I think, for IT teams, which is exciting.
Absolutely. It looks like we have one last question, and this is a good one. So I appreciate the insight on cybersecurity, but a bit surprised to see PKWARE as part of the conversation. I've used you guys for Zip before. Didn't know you did cybersecurity. Jason, it seems like you should take that one.
I should probably take that. Yeah. You know, as someone who's born and raised in Milwaukee, you know, I mean, PKWARE was, you know, kind of that famous company, right? Because they did put the zip file format out, you know, when I was, I think 12 years old, right? And it's kind of cool to be working for a company where, you know, if you open up any zip file in a text editor, regardless of where it was made, right? You know, the first two characters are PK, right? And it's such a ubiquitous thing that, you know, just to be a part of that kind of roots of the organization. But yeah, I mean, since then, obviously the shift to encryption happened in early 2000s, and then, you know, adding the capabilities of discovery and classification and kind of automating that experience is what really pushed us into the world of data protection. So, you know, now that we do enterprise data protection for companies, we have masking, redaction, encryption solutions, and we actually do help with some of those retention policies as well. So we still sell the data compression software, believe it or not. But the bulk of the business now is in cybersecurity.
So Heidi, we always ask people this. When was the last time you zipped a file? You physically zipped a file?
I don't think I can remember the last time I did that, like zipping a file. I know I've unzipped one recently.
There you go. Yeah, we always like to keep people on their toes with that one. They either seem very nostalgic about it and have a great story about the last time they zipped a file, or they have your exact answer, right? I can't tell you the last time I did it. So that actually wraps up all of our questions. There's no more questions in the chat. If anyone has any questions after, please reach out to us at pkware.com. But I really want to thank our guests, Heidi Shey and Jason Dobbs. But with that, we'll close out the webinar. Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
Thanks, sir.